The ships came in vast columns, miles wide and miles long. Thousands of them stretched from horizon to horizon. It was an armada the size of which the world had never before seen, one that carried hundreds of thousands of soldiers from at least 5 nations who would soon be thrust ashore on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. This was D-Day, June 6th, 1944. The landing craft surged and pitched in the heavy channel swells. Ahead lay the beaches with their forbidding rows of obstacles. Beyond loomed the bluffs, where concrete blockhouses studded the high ground and thick loops of barbed wire coiled around them in a menacing embrace. Behind the beach defenses, a powerful armored reserve waited to strike. As the troop-laden landing craft began the run toward the beaches, the men knew that they were unique in the annals of military conflict. True, they were invaders, but they came to liberate, not to conquer. This was their crusade, one that many who began the journey on this cold and wet spring morning would never complete. Here, in this moment of history, were the Allies in all their greatness. They had spent vast treasure and sacrificed thousands of their young men to learn the hard lessons of battle in preparation for this supreme moment. It had been a long road to D-Day, and it was a journey that had begun not with great success, but in terrible defeat. They moved with the slow, lurching gait of an army defeated. The limits of their endurance had long been passed, and now just putting one foot in front of the other became an act of sheer willpower. Behind them, in the wake of their retreat, lay the debris of a shattered army. This was France, 1940, the low point of Allied fortunes in World War II. 2 weeks into the German invasion of the West, the Allied battle plan lay in ruin, torn apart by marauding panzers, which seemed to appear on every flank to sow chaos, death, and panic.
When you look at the strategic problem of an invasion of France from both sides, you see that the French have constructed the Maginot Line, which effectively covers the majority of the German-French border. Then you have a sector of the area known as the Ardennes Forest, which is dense and impassable, difficult terrain. So difficult that the French and British planners dismiss it as a possible avenue of major attack. And so the only possibility in terms of the French and British strategic thinking is a movement through the Low Countries and Belgium into metropolitan France, a copy of what the Germans did in World War I. Well, Belgium's still neutral, so they don't have the option of moving forward and defend along the Belgian-German border. So what they do is they mass their best and most mobile units on the Franco-Belgian border in preparation for a movement in should the Germans invade Belgium. Of course, the Germans were pretty aware of what the Allied plans were, and they determined that they will strike through the Ardennes, through this impassable forest. Turns out not to be so impassable. There is a secondary German attack into Belgium. As planned, the Allies move forward. So when the Germans sweep in behind what is in effect the best part of the Allied armies, which are advancing into Belgium, it unhinges all the Allied plans and gives the Germans an edge that the Allies never recovered.
Now, with no hope of stopping the Wehrmacht, the French and British could only try to escape. For the British, that meant evacuation from the continent and getting what they could of the expeditionary force home. If the British Army could survive, so too could the Allied cause. One final effort brought the British to the port of Dunkirk.
I shall never forget my first views of the Dunkirk area. It was like a scrapyard. There were disabled vehicles lying on either side of the road with barely room for people to get through. And it must be borne in mind that all this time, and with all this movement we made, we were hampered by the refugee columns streaming away from the Germans.
As Allied forces fell back on Dunkirk, a defense perimeter was established around the city, but it was soon overrun by German panzers. The Allied forces at Dunkirk were about to be bagged, but on May 24th, help arrived from a most unexpected source.
At the end of May, Hitler actually orders the panzers to halt. And the reason for this was basically twofold. First, Göring convinced Hitler that the Luftwaffe could prevent the evacuation of the British Army with air power alone. And then, with the British Army trapped at Dunkirk with no way out because their sea power had been destroyed by the Luftwaffe, then Hitler could dictate peace terms to the British.
The pause gave the Allies time to regroup, and when the German advance resumed, resistance had stiffened.
Two of us had stayed behind to blow up an obstacle, and as we were blowing it up, we could hear the German troops marching down the road. And my colleague and I hid in a ditch and covered ourselves up while these German soldiers marched past.
The Royal Navy hastily marshaled a fleet of destroyers, transports, channel ferries, and coastal steamers to rescue the survivors from the docks and beaches.
We got into the area of Dunkirk, dug into the sand dunes and waited. About 2 days later, a couple of destroyers came inshore and we joined the queue of men embarking on these destroyers.
The German Luftwaffe threw hundreds of aircraft against the evacuation fleet, and in spite of the heroic efforts of the Royal Air Force, 6 destroyers and over 200 other craft were lost.
Hardly had we set sail in the destroyer when it was hit, and all the forecastle of the destroyer was blown out. We were fortunately on the deck, and many men were wounded.
As the situation at Dunkirk grew increasingly desperate, a motley collection of yachts, fishing boats, and other craft braved German shelling and bombing to rescue British and French soldiers trapped against the coast. For over a week, the Allies endured the inferno of Dunkirk, and 69,000 men bought time with their lives as the evacuation continued. When the final boat turned for England at the beginning of June, it carried the last of the approximately 330,000 men lucky enough to escape. The men had survived, but England no longer possessed an army.
The army was successfully brought back to England, but it was disorganized, demoralized, and largely disarmed. All the tanks, all the artillery, and all the vehicles stayed behind in France.
The British were gone, forced off the continent of Europe in a humiliating defeat. Soon after, France surrendered, and what Winston Churchill called the long night of barbarism fell over Europe. Britain stood alone, determined to carry on despite all. That determination inspired the hope that someday, somehow, the Nazi hold on the continent would be broken. And within that hope, the seeds for D-Day were planted. Berlin. The soldiers of the Third Reich return home to a hero's welcome after their stunning conquest of France. Now, in the summer of 1940, only the English Channel stood between Germany and her greatest victory. Hitler had hoped that Britain, like France, would make peace. But when that did not occur, the Germans developed a plan for a cross-channel invasion. It was dubbed Operation Sea Lion, and envisioned a massive air campaign followed by an amphibious assault. Gaining air superiority over the Channel was critical to the plan. This would not only prevent RAF interference with the air and seaborne phases of the invasion, but more importantly, control of the Channel would be wrested from the Royal Navy. Once the skies and seas were secured, the invasion could proceed. And with the state of the British Army, there could only be one eventual outcome. The German Navy had already begun the difficult task of assembling the shipping necessary to transport, land, and supply the Army for the campaign, when in September it became clear that the invasion wasn't going to happen after all.
Because the Germans are not able to achieve air superiority over the Channel, they scrub their invasion plans. And at that point, the English Channel becomes a barrier not just to the Germans, but also to the British. The reason why the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority is twofold. First, they misemployed their air assets at the end of the summer and went after political targets instead of going after the Royal Air Force. And second, the incredible resolve and bravery of the Royal Air Force's fighter pilots, the few as they've become known, helped stop the onslaught.
The remarkable bravery of those young men taking on this massive German force. I mean, so many of them lost their young lives doing it. If it hadn't been for them, as I say, Hitler could so easily have just taken over Britain.
As both sides watched their enemy across the gray waters of the Channel, the action of the war moved to the periphery. At sea, the Germans attempted to strangle Britain with a U-boat campaign that nearly succeeded.
England was getting beaten up pretty badly with the submarine warfare. They were running out of supplies and food, and submarines were really winning it at that point.
I'd been working on the generators after my watch, and I laid down, and it just like somebody had picked that ship up about 10 feet off of a solid concrete foundation and dropped it. But by the time I got on my bunk, got to the door and looked aft, the stern of the ship was going underwater already. And when the ship went down, the submarine came up, and the guy spoke English, had a machine gun pointed down at our lifeboat. But he wanted to know if anybody was hurt, if there's any officers. Of course, no officers on board. But if anybody was hurt, if we had food and water, know which way to go towards land, and good luck, and he left.
Britain's plight alarmed many Americans, yet most were reluctant to repeat the experience of World War I.
I think that this country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglement. Let Europe fight her own battle. Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
In the past, we have built with a Europe dominated by England and France. In the future, we may have to deal with a Europe dominated by Germany.
And it was precisely that possibility which President Roosevelt most feared. In spite of public opposition, FDR began cautious but deliberate steps to provide assistance to Great Britain. And in so doing, he gave America time to prepare.
The beginning of the American rearmament program is accelerated dramatically at this point, and many steps are taken to increase the manpower and the equipment available to the American armed forces. Something needs to be done right away, however. So as a way of forestalling or helping the British at this point, President Roosevelt offers to trade them 50 old destroyers from the World War I era for base rights in the Caribbean and places like that. And so that deal is made as a way to help Britain in a way that is not unacceptable to the American public.
In January of 1941, British and U.S. officers met secretly in Washington, D.C. to map out a joint strategy should America be drawn into the war. The meeting established a unified command structure and, more importantly, called for a priority being given to the defeat of Germany, even if America went to war with Japan.
In the 1930s, Japan had conducted a series of aggressive moves into China, first seizing Manchuria, then the coastal ports and large amounts of Chinese territory. The United States and Britain had not responded very strongly to this until, taking advantage of the fall of France, Japan moved into French Indochina in 1940. This directly threatened the British at Singapore and the Americans in the Philippines. The President of the United States issued an ultimatum demanding a Japanese withdrawal and threatening a tough embargo, cutting off oil and scrap metal to Japan, virtually guaranteeing that Japan would go to war.
In March of 1941, FDR signed the Lend-Lease Act into law, which allowed America to provide goods and services without immediate payment to nations whose defense the President considered vital to the defense of the United States.
People of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, This is an emergency as serious as war itself.
In August, a historic meeting took place between Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt. Known as the Atlantic Conference, it cemented a personal relationship between the two leaders and led to an announcement that together Britain and the United States would preserve world freedom and improve world conditions after the war. Of more immediate importance was FDR's announcement that American warships would begin escorting all Atlantic convoys west of Iceland.
The U-boats was doing so much damage, Roosevelt sent a bunch of the destroyers around there. And so my brother was on one of the tin cans. He was in the war before the war started.
United Press assigned me to become a war correspondent attached to the Navy. And almost immediately shipped out on my first convoy to England when the Battle of the Atlantic was at its height.
In October, the destroyer USS Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk with the loss of 115 lives. Despite pressure from Churchill, who desperately wanted America in the war, FDR did nothing. For now, Britain would have to stand alone. By 1941, Britain had fully mobilized its population. 94% of males between the ages of 14 and 64 were in either the military or war industries.
We were all very much indoctrinated into serving our country. Then the war came along, and Dad joined the Army within a week because he was in the First World War. And my two older brothers, who had been in the Navy, had transferred to the British Merchant Marine, and I lost them both.
My father was too old to be in active service, but he was in the Home Guard. But of course, a lot of it were older men, like my dad, and I think their arms were certainly very inadequate. I mean, there wasn't much in the way of weapons for them. But they would meet and march and, I don't know, do things that soldiers do.
I think the thought basically was, well, we've got to get on with what we've got, but we haven't got enough.
It was a remarkable effort, but the fact remained the British Empire did not possess the strength to tackle the Germans head-on. They could, however, strike back through the air, an idea that appealed to Churchill.
The British really didn't have much choice. They got thrown off the continent in 1940. They're not going to be back on the continent until 1944. What are they supposed to do in between? And so almost by default, the British had to try strategic bombing.
They came at night, British bombers flying individually to their target areas. Bombing by the light of the moon with primitive navigation, they used major German cities as targets. It was a war in the shadows, one where technology and the latest electronic gizmos would swing the balance of power to and fro. And in 1941, the Germans held the upper hand.
The German defenses were very good. Whenever we had a trip over Germany, Essen, Cologne, Dusseldorf, Hamburg, Mannheim, any of those, I got hold of every trip from flak. And then later on, and near the end of my tour, when they got the fighters, they were very good.
The losses suffered over the Reich were staggering, draining Britain of some of her finest men while putting an ever-increasing strain on her war effort.
If Churchill had hoped for a quick and easy victory with the Royal Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against Germany, he was destined to be disappointed. By 1941-1942, the Royal Air Force was sustaining terrible losses in those battles in darkness over German cities. And the Germans endured it. They were able to absorb the damage that the RAF was inflicting on them and continue their war effort and expand their war effort. Well, the British persisted, and the Royal Air Force continued their strategic bombing campaign in hopes that this campaign would avoid the necessity of an invasion of the European continent.
The British were unable to conduct cross-channel military operations after Dunkirk on any scale, but they wanted to keep the Germans off balance and looked around for ways to continue the war. One idea that was followed up was to set up some special units called commandos of highly trained troops who were sent on raids against the German-held coast from Norway down to France. These were very effective at gathering intelligence, prisoners, and raising morale at home with little successes to brag about. They sufficiently upset the German command that Hitler ordered any commando taken prisoner be shot on sight.
These coastal raids served notice to the Germans that the British were still capable of fighting back. More importantly, the experience gained in amphibious assault helped shape future landing operations. Yet, in spite of the best efforts of the commandos and Bomber Command, the Axis powers clearly retained the initiative.
Fascist Italy has held itself aloof from this conflict between Germany and the Allies until the point at which it's clear that France is defeated and England has withdrawn. At that point, Italy declares war and invades France and takes just a small slice of territory. But Mussolini's now casting about for other areas in which he can increase Italian prestige. So the obvious place to strike is at the British in North Africa.
The British Army in Egypt guarded the Suez Canal, the British Empire's vital lifeline. In September of 1940, Italian forces launched a two-pronged assault from Libya and Italian Somaliland that sought to wrest the canal from the British and, more significantly, gain control of Middle Eastern oil. Against all odds, the British Army defeated both Italian thrusts, then began a counteroffensive that drove Italian units from Somaliland. Instead of making a positive contribution to the Axis effort, the Italians had achieved just the opposite. Hitler had no choice but to send forces to North Africa to bolster his ally, an occurrence that posed an immediate threat. British troops were diverted to capture Vichy French Syria, within striking distance of the canal, before the Germans beat them to it. At the same time, other British units had to be shipped across the Mediterranean to support Greece. The Italians had attacked Greece in 1940, but found they had a tiger by the tail. Now, British intelligence learned that Hitler was planning to throw German troops into the fight, a move that would pose an additional threat to Britain's position in the Mediterranean.
Throughout the war, the Germans sent a lot of their military information, orders, reports by radio, but they were confident that these messages were encoded so that they could not be broken and could not be read by Allied intelligence. The Germans had a special device called the Enigma machine, which automatically encoded their messages, and they were sure nobody could break it. What the Germans didn't know, and what they never suspected during the war, was that British intelligence, with substantial help from the Poles, had broken the secret of the Enigma machine. They had been able to build their own version of it and were able during the entire war to read most of German military radio communications. This secret, which was called the Ultra Secret, was vital to the Allies throughout the war, and a special Ultra Committee was set up to decide what material should be passed on to Allied military commanders to use.
The British landed in Greece just in time to be crushed by the German invasion. The Wehrmacht made short work of Greek and British armies alike, throwing the Allies into a confused retreat. Driven south, abandoning their tanks and heavy weapons, the British divisions fled for the coast, where the Royal Navy evacuated them under heavy air attack.
At the end of the Battle of Greece, the British have to get their army off the continent again. And basically we see a repeat of Dunkirk, where British sea power is pitted against the air power of the Luftwaffe. And once again, as at Dunkirk, the Royal Navy succeeds in pulling the troops off the continent. Well, they did it at a terrible cost because the Royal Navy really didn't have any air support. So they get the troops off and they deliver them to Crete, an island in the eastern Mediterranean.
The Germans saw the British on Crete as a potential threat to their new gains in the Balkans. At the end of May 1941, they unleashed an airborne assault on the island that was designed to pave the way for an amphibious landing. Casualties during the initial drop were heavy, But the Germans, thanks to their total command of the air, had the flexibility to react and save the situation. The battle raged for 11 days as the Allied troops staged a fighting retreat across Crete's harsh mountains before being evacuated to Egypt.
The Germans demonstrated the capabilities of an all-out aerial invasion with their attack on Crete. Ironically, the Germans looked at their losses in Crete and said, never again. The Americans looked at the capture of Crete and said, we need to scale up.
If Greece and Crete had not proven the British Army was no match for the Wehrmacht, Rommel drove that lesson home in Libya. In the spring of 1941, he unleashed an offensive with minimal forces and minimal support, which threw the British back pell-mell toward Egypt.
These first attacks by General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps will really become the prototype for desert warfare. They are fast, quick, mobile strikes, not necessarily coming where you expect them to fall. They strive to get behind the British and force a withdrawal rather than fight an actual battle. And so you find the Germans, who have the smallest force, are driving the war and the nature of the war throughout the next several months.
By the summer, the North African campaign was absorbing almost all of Britain's available resources in armor, infantry, and shipping. Germany, on the other hand, never considered North Africa anything but a sideshow. For them, Russia was the main event.
Hitler had always had his mind on the East. The only place that he could hope to expand and build the, quote, Lebensraum, the living room for more of Germany, was to expand to the east, to take over Eastern Europe and specifically the Soviet Union. When the attack on Britain failed and Britain seemed to be fairly helpless, he turned his eyes to the east and began preparing Operation Barbarossa. The 30s had been a time of danger in Europe, as first Italy and then Germany had moved out to seize neighboring countries. As a result, in 1939, as the crisis escalated over Poland, the Soviets desperately sought to get Britain and France to agree to common war plans to fight together against German aggression. They got nowhere, and fearing that he would be left by himself to fight Hitler, Stalin cut a deal with Hitler instead. Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland between them, Hitler turned to the west, and Stalin hoped to have until 1942 to rebuild his armies. And he figured this would be a safe bet because France, then considered the greatest military power in Europe, should hold up the Germans for some time. It did not work out like that. France fell in 6 weeks, and Stalin found himself facing German power alone on the continent.
On June 22, 1941, the Germans launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union that involved over 300 divisions on a front over 1,000 miles wide. With the exception of a few air units remaining in France and Rommel's men in North Africa, the entire might of Germany's armed forces was thrown against the Red Army.
Operation Barbarossa is a smashing success for the Germans. In a matter of weeks, the German army makes tremendous operational incisions into Soviet territory. They encircle whole armies and more of the Red Army near the frontier. And within a few months, the Germans have taken 1 million prisoners. Nobody else's army could have sustained a beating of that sort and still been in the fight.
They were genuinely stunned when the Germans attacked in June of 41. And the first inkling was, but Moscow didn't say anything about this. Nobody told us to expect this. How could this happen?
The troops on the border could see the Germans getting more and more active across the way, and there was a great deal of alarm among the army on the frontier. But Stalin's interpretation of all the data that was being delivered to him was that this was a threat, that the Germans were going to make demands on the Soviet Union, which he could then negotiate and protract the negotiations, and if necessary, make major concessions just to win him the time to be ready to fight. The Soviets were also involved with the Germans on an economic basis. They had trade treaties that had the Soviets providing a great deal of oil and wheat to the Germans, and Stalin reasoned that the Germans could not easily do without this. Consequently, 4 days before the Germans attacked, An editorial appeared on the front page of Pravda saying all the rumors of bad relations between the Soviet Union and Germany are totally false and provocations being spread by somebody. We have excellent relations. There is no danger. Take it easy. And as a result, the armies did. Many veterans recount how there was a big letdown right then, a feeling, oh, okay, whatever's going on, the boss knows, it's cool. You know, we don't have to be on our toes, and then the axe fell.
A month after the attack began, the Germans were nearly halfway to Moscow and had already captured a landmass twice the size of Germany. Yet, despite the beating it took, the Red Army refused to collapse. In fact, the Russians launched repeated counterattacks, and while few succeeded, they did threaten and slow the German drive as the good campaigning weather slipped away. In front of Moscow, the Red Army absorbed a staggering German blow and then, almost miraculously, launched an attack that developed into an all-out counteroffensive. The Soviets pushed the exhausted Germans back from the capital and close to the brink of destruction.
The German army was already worn out. Before they started the offensive, each division and Army Group Center had suffered an average of 4,000 to 5,000 casualties. That means most of their infantry were gone. They weren't getting replacements for them. The panzer strength, the tank strength had dropped dramatically in the panzer divisions. And when the first counterattack went in the 4th and 5th of December, German front just collapsed. It fled back.
Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow, following their ability to halt the Germans at the gates of Moscow, indicated that Germany could no longer win the war on its terms. And in all likelihood, Moscow indicated, foreordained that the war would end in defeat.
The Eastern Front would occupy the vast majority of Germany's armed forces and become the grave of the Wehrmacht and Hitler's ambitions. Across the globe, the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor ended any debate on American military involvement.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The country was at war, but not against the enemy the president wanted to fight.
FDR can't declare war on Germany. The American public just won't buy that. War against Japan, sure, they attacked us, but a lot of Americans still didn't want to fight Germany, and there was no reason to. Hitler has been very careful to avoid direct confrontation with the United States. He knows he doesn't want to fight America because he's already got a war with Russia, he's already got a war with Britain. It might have taken months or even years, perhaps, for us to get into the war against Germany, and instead, Hitler handed it to us. The Fuhrer decides to declare war.
With that single act, the entire strategic equation in Europe was altered in favor of Britain. Churchill rejoiced, saying, "We have just won the war."
It was most welcome news, certainly. With the backing of America, there was a chance now of unlimited supplies and manpower.
What had begun with aggression in Europe and Asia had now developed into a global war.
Clearly, the democracies of the Western world, including the United States, were threatened. So I was, of course, as nearly all Americans were, quite ready, I think, for the United States to get into the war.
Pearl Harbor had changed America's resolve overnight. But patriotism alone was not enough. Although steps to improve military preparedness had been taken, American forces were, in the words of Churchill's senior military representative, more unready for war than it is possible to imagine.
We had trucks with the tank print, on the side, make it a tank. We had very, very few weapons because they pulled a lot of our weapons out and sent them over to England.
our rifles and everything. So we were without rifles for a long time, and the proper equipment we didn't have for a long time.
1939, our military ranked 16th in the world, right behind Romania. So we had a very high hill to climb.
No sooner had the smoke cleared from Pearl Harbor than Prime Minister Churchill and his senior military staff arrived in Washington, D.C. for the Arcadia Conference, a meeting which reaffirmed the Germany First strategy of the Allies, but also revealed significant differences in strategy. The Americans proposed a cross-channel operation for the spring of 1942, but Churchill and his commanders balked at such a direct approach. The British, having already suffered a series of reverses at the hands of the Germans, were not anxious to strike directly at the perceived strength of the Axis. Churchill himself declared that a defeat in an invasion attempt was the only way in which we could possibly lose this war.
In early 1942, the British were really in no position to launch any offensives into Northern Europe. And in February of 1942, this becomes abundantly clear when the British Army suffers its greatest defeat of the 20th century at Singapore, where some 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops get captured or killed by the marauding Japanese army in Malaysia. Well, because of the defeat at Singapore, because of the fighting in North Africa, because of their commitments elsewhere, the British, who by this point have fully mobilized their manpower reserves, don't have the available resources, the material, or the men to launch an invasion of France.
Although the American High Command tried to insist on the invasion of France, the British showed they were in charge at subsequent high-level inter-allied meetings. They were the veterans. They were the ones who knew the enemy. In the end, Roosevelt deferred to their strategic vision.
The British in World War II had some different attitudes about strategy and how to fight the Germans, and a lot of this was formed on the experience that they had in World War I during the botched Gallipoli campaign, where they invaded Turkey and tried to capture the Bosporus Straits, had failed miserably. So they were used to seeing amphibious operations that could go wrong. And in the Second World War, in 1942, when there was a big debate going on about when to invade Europe and how, a landing in Dieppe in the northern coast of France was attempted to test the German defenses.
The raid on the port of Dieppe really has 4 strategic goals. One is to raid a port and see if that's feasible at all. The second is to provoke a German reaction and kind of observe and gather intelligence on that reaction. The third is to draw the Luftwaffe into a battle with the RAF over the Channel. And the final thing is to placate Stalin and perhaps, if they can be successful here, cause the Germans to redeploy resources away from the Eastern Front.
If the British armed forces were truly committed to the raid at Dieppe, it was hardly evident as mission planning went forward. Although Fighter Command jumped at the chance to challenge the Luftwaffe, the Royal Navy would commit only destroyers, and Bomber Command opted out altogether. No overall commander was assigned, which meant that ground and naval forces would have separate commands and communications, and only a short pre-landing naval and aerial bombardment was scheduled. The men slated for the attack, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, would rely on a combination of speed and surprise. As the assault force, supported by British commandos and an American Ranger detachment, approached the coast of France in the early hours of August 19th, the left-wing flotilla, which was carrying the 3rd British Commando Unit, unexpectedly ran into a small German convoy. The ensuing battle completely upset the planned attack on Berneval and alerted part of the enemy defense.
The British commandos were tasked with taking out 2 objectives, one on each flank of the main landing beach, in both cases shore batteries. They were fairly successful, overrunning one battery and keeping the other pinned down with small arms fire. The main landings then followed, but by now the Germans were wide awake. They were hit with a very brief bombardment from British destroyers, and then 10 minutes of strafing and rocketing of British planes. That was it. Then the main landings went in.
The main Canadian assault waves reached the beach that morning later than planned, and in broad daylight. they were stopped virtually at the water's edge by intense fire from numerous strongpoints. Machine gun fire stitched their ranks, while mortar and artillery fire took a terrible toll on the exposed Allied troops. Churchill tanks landed to support the infantry were unable to penetrate a seawall and other obstacles that protected Dieppe. The Canadians were trapped, unable to advance, and with the water at their backs, they could not retreat. All they could do was endure. Overhead, the RAF got the fight it had wanted with the Luftwaffe, as German fighters from all over occupied Europe and as far away as Germany flew into the fray. As daring landing craft crews worked to evacuate the beachhead, the few Royal Navy destroyers that took part in the operation brought fire down on what they thought were German strongpoints. But with no way to communicate with the men on the beaches, they could not be sure. It was over by noon, and it had been a disaster. The Allies counted nearly 1,400 dead and 1,600 wounded. Over 2,000 men had been taken prisoner. The Royal Air Force lost more than 100 aircraft. Yet, however costly, invaluable lessons were learned, not the least of which was that attacking a fortified port was suicidal.
It indicated to the British that they were correct in their mind of not trying to launch too early an attack back on the continent, because there's going to take massive amounts of force to overcome the Germans, who were very capable.
The importance of communication between the troops ashore and their supporting ships had been made abundantly clear, as was the need for specialized armored vehicles and better landing craft. For Hitler, Dieppe seemed to validate his belief that strong defensive positions could defeat an invasion at the water's edge. Further, it solidified his view that future enemy assaults would center on a port. Hitler's conclusions, however, were not unanimously shared. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of OB West, stated it would be an error to believe that the enemy will mount his next operation in the same manner. Next time, he will do things differently. Von Rundstedt was right, though it would be nearly 2 years before the Allies would again assault Fortress Europe. In the meantime, the Allies had more learning to do, and again, it was the Germans who would provide the lessons. After Dieppe, the Allies abandoned the idea of an invasion of France in 1942. The overriding question then was where to attack the Germans and relieve the pressure on Soviet Russia. Events in North Africa soon provided the answer. In June, Rommel stormed the fortress of Tobruk and pushed the British back to El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria in Egypt. It looked like one more solid Axis offensive would carry them to Cairo. The Suez Canal was directly threatened, and beyond it, the vital oil fields of the Middle East. Churchill recommended a joint operation in North Africa to clear Axis forces from the continent. If successful, the sea lanes through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal would be secure. American military advisors who opposed any operations in North Africa saw the proposal as a thinly veiled British attempt to shore up their colonial interests in the region. Yet, in spite of objections, FDR believed it was essential to get U.S. troops in the war against Germany as quickly as possible. And in the end, Roosevelt sided with Churchill for lack of a better alternative. North Africa would be the target for 1942. The plan that took shape was codenamed Operation Torch.
The plan for Operation Torch is an incredibly complex affair. We have forces in place on England, and we have a great deal of forces being built up on the coast of America. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring those forces from England down in one fleet, and at the same time cross the Atlantic with a fleet from the United States to arrive simultaneously off the coast of Africa. at 3 different ports: Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca. But they don't want to assault these ports, which are also fairly heavily defended. Frontally, what they're going to do for the most part is land on both sides of the ports and then try to envelop them with pinchers. And in that way seize ports to make the support of this lodgment on North Africa much easier from a logistical standpoint.
Operation Torch began in the early morning hours of November 8th, 1942. From the outset, things went wrong. Units landed at the wrong place, landing craft overturned in the surf, and useless supplies reached the beaches from improperly loaded cargo ships. It was a mess, and had the Allies been facing the German army, Torch might have been a catastrophe.
When we landed in North Africa, the invasion of North Africa, we got a break. Our goal was to capture Casablanca, which was already empty of all Germans.
The troops that we were fighting then were French troops, because then France was under German dominion, under the government of Pétain.
The hardest part of Torch was not so much getting ashore, although there were a lot of mishaps with that. First of all, not knowing quite how the French would react. But once you're ashore, following up fast enough, because your real objective is Tunis, that's several hundred miles away.
By November 11th, negotiations had succeeded both in ending French resistance and winning French cooperation. And soon, British and American units began pushing east for Tunisia. Rommel's forces, in retreat from El Alamein after a defeat at the hands of Montgomery's Eighth Army, were now threatened from 2 sides. While the Allies rushed light forces forward from Algiers, the Germans reacted with a rapid buildup. The race for Tunisia was on, but it was a contest the Allies were destined to lose.
The American planners really hadn't given much thought to the advance into Tunisia. They'd put a lot more attention into simply getting on the African continent. They wanted to make sure that Torch succeeded, which is logical and reasonable, and really hadn't allocated a whole lot of time or resources to the subsequent advance. They run into lots of problems across a very difficult terrain, challenging mountains, limited road net, and it's winter. That thrown together made for a real logistical nightmare.
Eventually, the Axis brought in more than 150,000 men, and Rommel's troops, falling back before the British, were able to establish themselves behind the so-called Mareth Line in southeastern Tunisia. It was there that the Allied advance was brought to a halt by German resistance and winter rains. The situation hadn't changed when Churchill, Roosevelt, and their senior military advisors met at Casablanca in January 1943. On the agenda was the development of a plan for future operations against the Reich, and once again, the Allies found themselves at direct odds. The Americans pushed for the cross-channel invasion. The British resisted and instead proposed further operations in the Mediterranean.
The Americans believed that if we didn't do it now, the delay was actually going to help the Germans get stronger. They're going to have more time to prepare their defenses. So there's a joke that goes around that the Americans kept on coming up with ways to fight the Germans where they were, and the British kept on arguing for ways to fight the Germans where they weren't.
In the end, FDR deferred to the British and their strategy of chipping away at the periphery. Though Casablanca was the scene of much inter-Allied conflict, it took place in a much improved atmosphere. It was clear that the Germans and Italians in North Africa would be defeated, but there was also significant progress being made elsewhere. In the Atlantic, the U-boat threat was slowly being contained. Though merchant ship losses had risen sharply after America entered the war, a switch to the convoy system reversed the trend, while new construction more than made up for ships sent to the bottom. Furthermore, Allied anti-submarine efforts had driven U-boat losses ever higher. In Russia, where the majority of the German army was fighting, the Soviets had not only absorbed the latest German offensive at Stalingrad, but had unleashed their own attack just 2 weeks after the Torch landings. A twin-armed counteroffensive caught the Germans completely by surprise and trapped the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. But that was only the beginning.
continuing series of Soviet offensives rolled to the west, destroying the Hungarian Second Army, the Italian Eighth Army, half the German Second Army, half the German Fourth Panzer Army, and pushing the Germans headlong in flight. There was a hole open in the German front as big as the entire Western Front in World War I.
It's pretty noteworthy that the Battle of Stalingrad in the late fall of 1942 and the early winter of 1943 marks the first time in World War II that the Germans have really suffered a major defeat anyplace. German Sixth Army is lost in what becomes the Soviet encirclement of German forces.
The German Sixth Army, now trapped in Stalingrad, numbered some 300,000 men. Though Goering boasted that the Luftwaffe could supply the besieged army, it proved a hopeless task in the face of winter weather and strong Soviet opposition. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, only 90,000 shattered men remained.
The tremendous damage done at Stalingrad and by other strategic offensives launched in November 42 made it abundantly clear that Germany would lose the war in the Soviet Union. Would it lose the war overall? That was still unanswered.
As the last German troops marched out of Stalingrad and into captivity, in Tunisia, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was plotting his next move. Always aggressive, he designed a counteroffensive against the Allies that would push them away from Tunis and buy time for further reinforcements and supplies to arrive. By choice, his blow would fall on the American troops, who had never seen major combat.
This German counteroffensive that will fall on the American army in the area of the Kasserine Pass is the first test in combat for the American army. Now, a great deal of effort has been put forward by the Americans to prepare equipment, to learn from the Germans and gather doctrine. Now, all these factors are going to come together, and we're going to see how the American army fares in combat.
The 37th Infantry Regiment faced the Germans first, and they broke and ran, and we all had to retreat. They pulled the 37th out, morale gone. You can imagine their feeling because they knew what had happened, that they'd let us down.
The Germans knocked out something like 98 American tanks because they had superior knowledge, superior practice, and just knocked out our tanks.
The Battle of Kasserine Pass is widely held to show how green and inexperienced American troops were and how ill-suited to combat they were until they'd actually been under fire for a while. And I think it proves exactly the opposite. There were actually about 6 separate actions that made up the entire Kasserine Pass campaign. And in every one of those instances, you had an American force that was usually heavily outnumbered by an extremely competent, very battle-hardened German force, which usually enjoyed air superiority at this stage in the campaign. And when the Americans were pushed back, they usually retired in excellent order and were ready for combat the next day. That's not the behavior of a bunch of amateurs.
By the 22nd of February, the Germans had run out of steam and began to withdraw to their original positions. The counteroffensive had failed, but the impact of the fighting on the Americans was far-reaching.
It's essentially a wake-up call to the American Army that there are some problems of leadership, problems of training, problems with equipment, problems with logistics, probably the biggest ones of all, problems with close air support. I mean, there are a lot of lessons that are learned at Kasserine. Kasserine is a cold slap in the face.
My remembrances of Kasserine Pass were not fond memories, but if you had to be blooded, that was the place to be because it was rough. And we came out of it ready for more.
By mid-April, Axis forces had been pushed into the northeast corner of Tunisia. While Allied forces had gained experience and strength over the last 6 months, Axis units had been increasingly hampered by growing Allied air and naval raids on their supply line from Sicily.
British intelligence got word that the Germans were going to be bringing in a bunch of airplanes, reinforcing the remains of the Africa Corps and evacuating a bunch of equipment. So the 3 American fighter groups down there, along with some Brits, were programmed out there for 15-minute patrols in the area that they would come into Cape Bond. And our outfit was out there for its 15-minute period. We were halfway home when all of a sudden the radio came alive and we heard all the action starting. Well, we were low on fuel by that point, so we couldn't go back and join the fun, but the 57th just really had a field day.
We were escorting 50 Junkers 52, and over there it looked like a swarm of bees waiting for us. P-51s and Spitfires and you name it. We lost all the airplanes.
For the Germans, Tunis was a foretaste of things to come. From that point on, the Wehrmacht units would have to endure all the torments the full weight of Allied air power could inflict on them.
Tunisia campaign was the last time in its history the U.S. Army had to worry about enemy aircraft. From that time on, we've always operated under complete air supremacy.
The final Allied offensive of the North African campaign began on May 6th, and the next day, Allied troops entered Tunis and Bizerta. They found Axis units in a state of collapse. Resistance in North Africa ended when the Italian First Army surrendered in mid-May. More than 250,000 Axis prisoners were taken. The North African campaign was a valuable learning experience for the Americans, who put their doctrine, their men, and their equipment to the test for the first time.
After the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the British senior officers in North Africa really start sniping at Ike and at the quality and capabilities of the American Army. In fact, there's a reference to the American Army from the British side that they are basically our Italians, in other words, incompetent. Ike overlooked it for the sake of unity, and at the same time, he urged his men and his officers to learn from the British. And what the American Army learns is how to supply the troops in the field and how to employ air support to its best advantage on the battlefield.
Tunisia had clearly shown that to beat the German army, the Allies would need to gain command of the air. This would allow them to isolate the battlefield, cut off the Wehrmacht's source of supplies and reinforcements, and at the same time build up their own logistical system free of serious enemy interference. It was also evident that future Anglo-American operations would need to have a stronger, more cooperative command structure.
The Allied command structure that is initially used in North Africa is a little convoluted. We have confused chains of command that cross national boundaries going from American to British back and forth, and it causes some real problems. So they revised this command structure. So you're going to have higher headquarters, which will have combined commands, British and American officers working together effectively. The commander will be from one nationality, the assistant commander will be from the other. The staffs will be woven together. But the combat units will retain their integrity, and they will be one nationality or the other.
Operation Torch and the North African campaign laid the foundation for all future Anglo-American amphibious operations. The Allies were beginning to hit their stride, but they had yet to prove just how powerful they might become. In July 1943, an Allied invasion fleet, numbering more than 2,500 ships and carrying close to 500,000 men, sailed from North African ports. Led by General Dwight Eisenhower, it was the greatest Allied armada the war had yet seen. The target, Sicily, had been the source of much contention between the Allies at the Casablanca Conference back in January. The Americans saw this as a useless diversion from a cross-channel invasion, but the British had a different view.
For one thing, if you take Sicily, you pretty much cleared the transport across the Mediterranean. That means you've opened up the supply routes into Egypt, India, and this is important for the conduct of the war effort for the British Empire. Sicily has the advantage as well within air range of your air bases in North Africa, and you have a chance to knock Italy out of the war, so that it becomes kind of politically important.
Perhaps the most persuasive argument was that the forces were already in place and would not have to be redeployed. In the end, FDR again deferred to the British. Preparations for Operation Husky, the code name for the invasion of Sicily, began immediately after the Casablanca Conference. 7 divisions were to wade ashore along a 100-mile front in southeastern Sicily, while elements of 2 airborne divisions landed behind Axis lines, the first large-scale use of airborne troops by the Allies.
The island of Sicily is being held by between 200,000 and 300,000 Axis troops. The Italian commander doesn't have enough people to adequately defend everywhere along the coast, so he chooses to concentrate his limited number of mobile troops in the center of the island and use that reserve to react to the Allied landing wherever it occurs.
The invasion got off to a rough start as a fierce storm whipped up the sea and seriously endangered some of the smaller craft.
And so happened we blundered into what they called a 100-year storm right off the bat. It was one of the worst storms I had ever seen, and of course I hadn't seen very many, but come morning the storm let up a little bit, and it wasn't long before we were approaching the south coast of Sicily.
Arriving in poor weather so quickly after the fall of North Africa combined to take the Axis completely by surprise.
There was no resistance at my beach. It's called Yellow Beach. It was 2 or 3 miles east of the town of Licata, what the Americans call it Licata, of course.
The port we invaded was not defended, so we met little resistance there and were able very quickly to set up our operation to run Gila as a port.
While the beach landings went smoothly, the unexpected storm and pilot error caused the initial airborne portion of the invasion to be widely scattered.
I had no concern but what we were going to be where we were supposed to be. It was pretty obvious quickly that we weren't.
We were supposed to parachute into the south central part of Sicily, but unknowns to me, I was on the wrong end of the island, and nobody told us that the British were going to be on the Syracuse end of the island. We didn't know the British were supposed to be there. They didn't know we were supposed to be there because we weren't supposed to be. So there were some cases of firing at each other and killing allies, you might say.
When we went out the door, you saw lots of parachutes in the air. When we got on the ground, you couldn't find a soul. Getting together at night was one of our major chores. We did finally get about 30 or 40 people together within an hour.
The paratroops, forced to operate in small, isolated groups, created considerable confusion in Axis rear areas, attacking patrols and cutting communication lines. July 11th, the second day of the invasion, saw increased enemy resistance. German and Italian divisions were sent against the center of the American line, while Axis planes mounted a series of heavy air raids on the fleet.
We did have pretty intensive air raid attacks because every beachhead is a prime air target because there's a big concentration of troops and materiel.
I remember a dive bomber diving on a ship, and it just disappeared in a big bunch of smoke and flame, and there wasn't anything left, nothing even on the surface for a while. We knew we were in the war.
The strength of the enemy attacks had surprised General Patton, who asked that his battle-weary center be reinforced. That night, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was sent in. The order, when combined with the events of the day, set the stage for a tragedy. As the transports flew over the darkened Allied fleet, nervous anti-aircraft gunners opened fire.
That was the awfulest sight I ever saw. Usually when one gets hit, there's a big flash of light, and you see guys falling out of it. And some of them fell out and came down okay. Others just exploded. Depends on where the plane was hit.
About 23 planes and 230-some people were lost. And that was kept quiet, primarily because in those days it was thought that any bad news was a solace to the Germans.
Over the next 2 days, the 7th Army gradually pushed its way out of the coastal plain and into the hills ringing the American beachhead. The dispirited and ill-equipped Italian coastal units hardly put up a fight.
Our biggest trouble in Sicily was the local Italian troops wanted to all give up to us, pretty near all of them.
Sicily was such a cakewalk to begin with just the Italians, but finally we had to go find where the Germans were.
We cut through right through the center of the island under General Patton. And we moved fast. It was tough going. We had a lot of opposition at times, and other times we just overcame the enemy because of our speed.
As we were advancing across the Genesee Plain, a 75-millimeter projectile bounced off the turret of my tank, just 16 inches from my face, went past my left ear. Ears have been ringing ever since. And it scared the hell out of me, of course.
The battle at Troina was one of the very worst battles we had. The Germans fought well. They've used every trick in the book, but they did it honorably.
I mean, the Germans basically just fight a delaying action. There's no real intent to hold Sicily once the Allies land. It's a foregone conclusion we're going to take it. It's just a question of when and how and whether or not we're going to cut off the Germans.
Well, the Sicily campaign was completed in 38 days from the time it first started. And unfortunately, the enemy got out of Sicily with a lot of troops and a lot of equipment. And that hurt us really bad later on during the rest of the Italian campaign.
How did they withdraw across the Straits of Messina when we had naval and air superiority? It's a mystery to me. I have to get someone else to tell you how that one happened.
The situation in the Mediterranean forced Hitler to divert more badly needed troops down into the boot of Italy, a move made more urgent by his doubts about his mostly ineffective ally. The Italians never lose a war, he said. No matter what happens, they always end up on the winning side. Hitler's concern was not misplaced. On July 25th, even before the fall of Sicily, King Victor Emmanuel ousted Mussolini and installed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as head of a new government. Badoglio immediately began negotiations with the Allies. Events now occurred in rapid succession. On the 3rd of September, an Allied landing occurred on the toe of the Italian boot at Calabria, which caused the Germans to move several mobile divisions south. On the 8th, the Italians announced their surrender. Field Marshal Kesselring's German troops quickly disarmed their former allies. Then on the 9th of September, Allied landings were staged at Taranto and Salerno. Kesselring had anticipated that an invasion would fall near Salerno, and strong mobile forces quickly moved to the area.
The beach itself initially was undefended, but once we were ashore, then there was a lot of resistance.
The Germans could predict you were coming because the Americans always did an operation under air cover. You could draw a protractor on a map and draw a circle of this is how far their fighters can reach, therefore this is where they can land. And where's a beach? Salerno.
The problem with Salerno is that it's surrounded by high ground. And the Germans got an awful lot of stuff there awfully quickly and really gave the beachhead a hard time.
We were told it was the Hermann Goering Tank Division was making an attack on the beachhead. Happily, our harbor was still full of combat vessels as well as transports, and the heavy guns from our Navy were able to destroy that attack.
4 days after the initial landing, the situation on the ground remained precarious. Desperate to get more troops into the embattled beachhead, but short of landing craft, General Mark Clark requested airborne reinforcement.
It was a combat jump, but it wasn't really a combat jump because we jumped on the beach. And we didn't actually jump
really behind the lines.
The pathfinders went in, set up around the field, and lit flares as we came in. They lit the flares, we jumped, and they doused the flares.
We jumped right in the middle of it, just above where they were fighting on the beach, but right between the artillery and the tanks. So we had to fight both ways, and that was a hellhole for about 20 hours.
This is not what anybody wants to do with airborne troops. They're being dropped in to reinforce semi-failure, not to expand the beachhead. It's to stop the beachhead from disappearing. And you end up doing essentially a defensive operation against enemy armor, something that is the last thing airborne troops are equipped for. But you do it because there's nobody else to do it.
Despite vigorous efforts by the Wehrmacht, by September 16th, it became clear to Kesselring that the Allies could not be dislodged. He directed his forces to begin an orderly withdrawal north. The beachhead had survived, but only by the slimmest of margins. Thanks to extremely effective naval and aviation support, quickly deployed airborne reinforcement, and the courage and capability of Allied soldiers, a disaster was averted.
It took a while for us to learn exactly how tanks, infantry, and artillery needed to be orchestrated on the battlefield. And it is, in a sense, fortunate that we were able to learn these lessons in these subsidiary theaters of war, rather than have to learn them against the first team, so to speak, in Northwest Europe.
For the Allies, Salerno reinforced the need for more landing craft, for it was the shortage of these vessels that constrained the Allied response to the German armored counterattack. The battle also drove home the fact that control of the air was essential for the success of any amphibious operation.
It is in the Mediterranean theaters, North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, that the United States military developed a capability for tactical air support that it had lacked before the war. And these lessons carried directly over into the later campaigns in Europe.
The Germans viewed the battle with a combination of frustration and dread. Their counterattacks nearly drove the Allies back into the sea, but ultimately they failed under the weight of Allied air and naval support. It was a scenario that was likely to reoccur, and after Salerno, the Germans became increasingly hesitant to use their mobile reserves within range of Allied naval gunfire. It was a tendency that would have drastic consequences in Normandy, but that was still months away. After the battle for the Salerno beachhead had ended, the Allies began gathering their strength in anticipation of an attack toward Naples, while the Germans established a strong defensive line south of Rome.
The campaign up the Italian peninsula was mostly mountainous. Roads, when there were any, it rained so hard that the roads were mud, and it was really tough going.
North of Naples, the Volturno River flows through a valley, and the German troops established their defense line on the north bank of the Volturno River.
And that was the first place I really experienced heavy firing. And we got a lot of artillery and a lot of mortar fire, and had quite a few casualties along the Volturno River.
We lost a lot of troops there by drowning and by sniper fire and machine gun fire.
The situation would remain at a virtual stalemate for months, as the Germans performed a series of withdrawals to prepared defensive lines, each more formidable than the one before. The campaign in Italy had become what the Americans had feared, a grinding battle of attrition absorbing far too many resources. Yet in spite of the lack of quick progress, the primary Allied goals established before the invasion of Italy had all been achieved. The Mediterranean was now secure. Italy had been forced to withdraw from the war, and at least 23 German divisions were tied down, while the Allies continued their buildup for a cross-channel invasion. But just when would that much-anticipated event occur? With the British demanding further operations in southern Europe and the Americans insisting on France, The stage was set for a bitter political battle within the Allied High Command. Franklin Roosevelt, in a masterpiece of political maneuver, ambushed Winston Churchill at Tehran. It was December 1943, and the Big Three had gathered together for the first time to discuss a joint strategy for the destruction of the Third Reich. The war still hung in the balance. While the Western Allies had knocked the Italian government out of the fight, the Germans had dug in south of Rome, across the Apennine mountain range. Their fierce defense thwarted every attempt to break through. And by the end of 1943, the Italian campaign could have been lifted straight out of World War I. Churchill's soft underbelly of Europe, as he called Italy and the Balkans, ended up being a mud-slogging campaign of attrition that cost thousands of lives for little gain. In Russia, the Soviet army had turned a German offensive into a shattering defeat at the Battle of Kursk, the greatest clash of armor in World War II. Well aware of German intentions, the Soviet High Command allowed the Wehrmacht to strike first. But after 2 weeks of heavy fighting, they unleashed attacks of their own, culminating in late August at the Battle of Kharkov. Losses for both sides were appalling. Between early July and the end of August, it's estimated that more than 1 million men were either killed or wounded. The Soviet victory at Kursk marked the end of German successes in the east. From then on, the Wehrmacht would be fighting defensive battles all the way back to the frontiers of the Reich and into the Reich itself.
Kursk did not bleed the German army white. Their losses actually were not insupportable for the entire operation. The problem is they didn't get a break for the next 4 months. And by 44, you can't even slow down the Russians.
Over the Reich, the combined Allied air offensive had been stalemated by the Luftwaffe. Through 1943, the American 8th Air Force increased its strength until it could field hundreds of B-17s and B-24s over Germany. The problem was, each time they appeared, the German fighters slashed through their tight formations and with cannon blazing, knocked down dozens of bombers each raid. At times, American losses approached 50%, and more men were dying in the skies over Europe than were dying in the trenches of Italy.
As the bomber losses mounted in the fall of 1943, the 8th Air Force was eventually forced to suspend daylight bombing raids into Germany itself. And the reason for this was they lacked a long-range escort fighter to give the bombers protection all the way to the targets and back. And the solution to this problem lay in the P-51 Mustang. But it wasn't until December of 1943 that the first P-51 group was deployed into England. So in the meantime, not only had strategic bombing not had decisive results on the war effort, but the Germans still held command of the air over the Third Reich.
If progress on land and in the air was frustratingly slow for the Allies, the war at sea had finally turned in their favor. Through much of 1943, the Western Allies had scored significant successes. With additional long-range patrol planes, along with hunter-killer task forces built around escort carriers, the Allies began the year with a blitz on the Atlantic U-boats. As the campaign gained momentum, dozens of German submarines were destroyed. The efforts at sea were aided by Allied code breakers who continued to glean valuable information through ultra-intercepts.
They knew what orders they were sending the German U-boats. They could hear the reports of the German U-boats back to their headquarters, and that gave them a tremendous edge. Knowing where the U-boats were, where they were concentrating, the Allies were able to reroute their convoys or to focus their own hunter-killer groups on the concentration of German submarines.
By the end of 1943, the Allies were sinking over 60 German submarines a month. The situation had become so critical that Admiral Dönitz withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic. The Allies were slowly gaining the upper hand, but it had been a titanic struggle. The overriding question the Big Three needed to answer at Tehran was how they would work together to destroy the Third Reich in 1944.
The alliance of the Big Three was a matter, like any coalition, of sleeping in the same bed but having somewhat different dreams. Churchill's primary concern was the preservation of the British Empire, realizing that Britain had been badly weakened by the war. Stalin's primary concern was very simple. He wanted the Allies to get into the fight with Germany in a big way and get some of the Germans off his back. The United States was treading a course between them, uneasy about the British colonial ambitions and a little bit worried about the Soviets, but trying really hard to maintain the unity of the coalition and keeping a straight push towards a fight with Germany in a big way soon.
FDR and his military advisors had spent most of 1943 arguing with the British over a cross-channel invasion. In the spring of that year, the Americans succeeded in getting the British to form COSAC, a headquarters study group whose mission was to create the blueprint for a landing operation in France. From the outset, the planning was plagued by inter-allied differences. The Americans wanted to invade Normandy. The British wanted to land at Pas-de-Calais, since it was closer to England and would be easier to supply.
The Americans eventually win this argument, and this actually becomes a signal moment in the relationship between the Allies in 1943. From this moment on, the Americans really become the dominant partner in the strategic alliance between the United States and Britain, and they begin dictating to the British the strategic course of the war. And, of course, the fulcrum of this is COSAC, the COSAC plan, which becomes codenamed Overlord.
When the Big Three sat down for their first meeting at Tehran, FDR spent the first hour giving Stalin a surprise and captivating description of the Cossack plan. Stalin embraced it and declared, "Overlord is essential to beat the Germans. Make it the basic operation for 1944.
Roosevelt's presentation came as a complete surprise to Churchill. Churchill had still hoped to drag out operations in the Mediterranean, perhaps an invasion into the Balkans to forestall Soviet advances into Eastern Europe and maintain British influence in the region. He still was deathly afraid of a full face-to-face fight with the Germans in Northern Europe in France. Between Stalin and Roosevelt, they had Churchill in a corner and forced him to agree to the operation.
After 18 months of Anglo-American squabbling, Overlord had finally been given the green light. A week later in Tunis, North Africa, Roosevelt designated General Dwight D. Eisenhower Supreme Commander of the new Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower, or Ike as he liked to be called, had already successfully led the invasions of North Africa and Sicily. Now the Allied forces were counting on him to do it again.
Throwing yourself at an enemy who's had 4 years to prepare his defenses of the coast is a very chancy operation of war. Amphibious warfare in previous world conflict was a very problematic affair, and this time we had to get it right.
The when and where of arrival is not for publication, but the why is common knowledge. Another great influx of American units for the invasion of Europe.
The decision to invade France was preceded by an American invasion of England. Many months before the amphibious assault on Normandy was set to take place, thousands of American soldiers set sail for Great Britain. In the late fall of 1943, there were roughly 360,000 Americans in England, and most of these were aviators and airmen. Almost all the combat units to come across the Atlantic had been redeployed into the Mediterranean. Though some supplies had been stockpiled in England, much work needed to be done to get enough gasoline, spare parts, vehicles, ammunition, and food from the United States to depots in England to make Overlord feasible. Early in the war, German U-boats had reaped a grim harvest on shipping bound for England, but the balance had shifted, and convoys were getting across with fewer losses. Even so, the North Atlantic crossing remained extremely dangerous.
actually crossed in one of the largest, I was told, one of the largest convoys ever to go across the Atlantic. I think there was something like 160 ships. And we lost, as I recall, 6 or 7 ships on the way. And I happened to see one, which was a very, very unpleasant sight to see because it happened to be a tanker and it exploded, and you know that there were probably no survivors.
As the convoys slowly plied the waters of the North Atlantic, their hulls were virtually bursting with the tools of war. If there was one factor that gave the Allies an edge in the coming battle, it was America's ability to produce staggering amounts of war material. In addition to the tens of thousands of men America would provide, a tremendous amount of the equipment that would be employed on D-Day had come from the forges of American industry. In the first 5 months of 1944, 800,000 troops and 9 million tons of supplies reached England, all earmarked for the invasion of France.
England was an armed camp. You could look out on the fields and see nothing but tanks, maybe 40 acres of nothing but tanks in a row, and another 40 acres further away with nothing but 1.5 ton trucks, and another one jeeps. And England was a arsenal, actually, a huge depot for the invasion buildup.
As American divisions would come from the United States to England, we then would have practice invasions with them.
They were based largely at Slapton Sands because that was a beach, a sandy beach, that had some of the same characteristics that Utah and Omaha had.
We would take the Green American Division
that do the same thing, come back out, then they come back to port, load the tanks up, M7s, all equipment, bring them back to where we started off at. They just constantly did that from February all the way to May.
Those were good training exercises. And there was also training exercises that went on for the Rangers who later made the assault at Pointe du Hoc. They were training on some of the bluffs at like Dover and other places like that.
We spent Christmas and the months up to the Normandy invasion in one practice invasion after another.
Assault training included every phase of the coming battle.
Did a lot of night training, made more combat jumps, and when we didn't jump at night, we would get on a truck and camp, and then they would take us out to some road, and we would get off the truck spaced out, as though you had jumped from a plane, and then you would make your maneuvers, assemble like you were going to in a combat jump.
We knew this was going to be the biggest thing that we had been in up to that time, and we trained pretty seriously.
While the men who would form the spearhead on D-Day were crucial to Overlord's success, it was the behind-the-scenes work of support staff, in many cases drawn from the ranks, that would tip the balance in favor of the Allies.
I reported to actually Eisenhower headquarters in London, learned very quickly that we had been selected to organize the beaches on Omaha Beach.
I reported to London, and there we studied by heart Normandy. I mean, I don't know why there was a bunch of us kids, but everybody had a sector of Normandy, and they knew, pardon me, exactly where we were going, and I had to memorize every town, every road, everything about Normandy.
It was a hectic time, but I was always amazed that people like me who were just an enlisted man working in the war room, seeing all the preparations. At night, I was free to go out to the pub or go any place I wanted to.
In spite of the obvious security risk, many soldiers were able to get up to London on a 2-day pass.
There were, Polish, there were French, who were now stationed in Britain. But then when the Americans began arriving, the streets were absolutely cluttered.
They had this lovely accent that we all fell for because they were all like the movie stars we've been watching, the pictures for years. But they were generous to a fault. They never came on a date without a can of peaches or a carton of Camel cigarettes. We just loved them.
The people were very nice, I say, extremely nice.
The countryside is all green, very wet, very damp. The summertime, I think, consisted of approximately a week of good weather spread out. Maybe it was a bad year.
The countryside was absolutely beautiful, and the pubs were wonderful places to go.
They were just jammed, and they were fun places. They weren't like bars, drinking bars. They were just, you went there and just, everybody talked, full of smoke, full of servicemen, servicewomen, and girls. And you just let down. It was a great, as I say, the best of times and the worst of times.
If you treat them just like you'd like to be treated, be the first to offer a cigarette. I didn't smoke, but we were given rations, That was like gold. Go to the pub. Oh, man, I tell you, go to the pub. And you guys smoke? My God, they came around real quick.
You'd go into London, bomb start, everybody collected in a subway, the underground, as they called it. That was where they would take shelter until the air raids were over. But they were a tough, gutty bunch of people.
We had 2 officers billeted. My parents, this is did. You were just issued the order, these 2 will be billeted at your house, and that's that. But they were, as I remember, very nice.
They warned us when we got into the English homes that the English people didn't really have very much, and to be careful what you took from them. Well, he'd always ask us to have a drink evening, and we said, no, Major, So one day he said to me, John, he said, you've been here long enough now to know where the cellar is. He said, get on and get me a bottle of scotch. And I went down in the cellar. They had a room full with cases of scotch. And I went back up and I said, we don't have to worry about the Major. We can accept his hospitality for a drink.
My father and a lot of other fathers said they're oversexed, overdressed, overpaid, and over here.
I think a lot of the resentment came from British men because, of course, the Americans tended to have far more money. They had nicer uniforms. So I think a lot of British men were not that happy with this flood of Americans.
In the early months of 1944, the final command structure was put together for Eisenhower's headquarters. Dubbed Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, Eisenhower's staff included a high proportion of senior British officers. When General Montgomery first took a look at the Cossack plan for Overlord in January of 1944, he immediately recognized that it would need to be drastically expanded for it to succeed. The original plan called for 3 divisions to be pushed ashore on D-Day. Monty and Ike agreed that this was too few. The Germans could cordon off such a small force with panzer units, and the push to expand the beachhead would stall. Instead, Monty proposed adding another beach in both the American and the British sectors, as well as 3 airborne divisions that would be dropped behind the beach defenses. Everyone agreed this was the right way to go, but the expansion created a significant problem. There simply were not enough landing craft available in the theater to get 5 divisions ashore on the first day of the invasion. In the end, Overlord had to be delayed by a month to allow further production from the U.S. to reach England.
So they're building them in the streets of New Orleans, just roping off streets and building Higgins boats. They're building them so fast that they're on trains headed out of town. People are still painting them gray, putting the numbers on them.
The landing craft shortage also caused the proposed invasion of southern France to be pushed back 2 months. These twin solutions solved the landing craft dilemma, but without a comfortable margin. Should the Germans destroy vast numbers of Allied LSTs on D-Day, supplying the men ashore might become an impossible task.
Until they could capture a port, in this case, Cherbourg, the Allies would be dependent on supplies they could bring in over the beaches. That's a difficult thing to do up. These were called mulberries. They included all kinds of ingenious devices that had been made with great effort and imagination and, of course, resources. These included breakwaters, floating piers, and other devices that would allow ships to unload their supplies over a beach, even though there wasn't a real established port there.
American and British officers would work to develop the plan and thus know the innermost secrets of the operation. These officers and the secret documents they studied were codenamed Bigot.
They were extremely careful about who came into knowledge that would consider them to be of a nature that needed to be bigoted. In other words, there were not very many people who were bigoted early on. As you became closer to the day for the invasion, then of course this information was spread among more people.
While Ike and his staff prepared and planned, Churchill fretted. Time and again, as the armies trained in the English countryside, the great Prime Minister fell prone to bouts of pessimism. He told Ike and other senior leaders that he had visions of the flower of England's youth dying on the Normandy beaches. His anxiety only increased after the Anzio landings in February. Following the successful invasion of Italy in September 1943, the Allied advance had ground to a halt due to poor weather, rough terrain, and stiffening resistance. As a result, Allied planners were looking for a way to break out of the costly struggle that was consuming enormous numbers of men and scarce supplies. In early November, Lieutenant General Mark Clark was directed to formulate a plan for landing a single division at Anzio, a site that was within striking distance of Rome, but still in reach of Allied aircraft operating from Naples. The target date was late December, but the subsequent lack of progress and a chronic shortage of troops and shipping due to the ongoing buildup for the Overlord operation made the initial landing date impractical. It wasn't until January 22, 1944, that troops of the Fifth Army swarmed ashore on a 15-mile stretch of Italian beach near the towns of Anzio and Nettuno.
The landing at Anzio was, at least in our sector, was fairly uneventful. I think we totally took the Germans by surprise on that landing. But once we were on the beach, then we just moved inland as fast as we could.
The Anzio operation is almost Salerno on a larger scale. You have, first of all, an apparent confusion in what is our purpose, in that the fellow on the spot says, essentially, all we got to do is get ashore and dig in, while somebody else is saying you get ashore and you head for Rome, while the forces that get ashore don't have the mobility to go for Rome, while the beachhead you are trying to consolidate is tactically horrible.
The hills completely surrounded the area, probably about 10 miles back. And beyond the hills was the main road from Rome to down through Pascasino, which was, of course, to be our first objective, was to cut that road. We never got there.
I'm not entirely certain that Lucas's decision to sit there and consolidate the beachhead at Anzio, and it's a very criticized decision, wasn't the right decision under the circumstances. Had he gone to Rome instead of consolidating the beachhead, would the beachhead have survived? Because again, the Germans were able to put together a pretty potent counterattack force.
We were surrounded by about 10 divisions, and they held all the high ground. There were a lot of casualties, mostly by mortars and by artillery.
There was a lot of fire coming in from the hills, and during the time that the division spent at Anzio, a 380 millimeter cannon was set up about 20 miles or so back into the hills, firing on us, and they would, it was a railroad gun, so they would fire 2 or 3 shells, whatever they figured they could without being detected, then roll the gun back into a tunnel. And so our aircraft were never able to locate them.
I think it was a mistake to go on Anzio. We did not accomplish anything. Not a thing. To me, it was Churchill's folly, I think, because he's the one that said we should go in and relieve the pressure up there, and I don't see how we did.
Churchill said I had hoped to fling a wildcat upon the beach, and all I got was a stranded whale. And that type of thing. But Churchill didn't give us enough landing craft, enough ships to even supply the campaign, so that was why it failed. And we sat there all winter.
Anzio failed to break the stalemate in Italy and thus became a source of ongoing angst for the Allies. Over the next 4 months, the Italian campaign would see some of the most savage fighting of World War II. Fortunately, there was some good news in the early months of 1944 thanks to the efforts of the Allied Air Forces and their massive campaign against the Luftwaffe. The American 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command, bolstered by the arrival of several long-range fighter groups, undertook a massive effort to destroy the Luftwaffe and its production facilities. Culminating in February with what became known as Big Week, the campaign essentially broke the back of the Luftwaffe's daylight fighter force. Big Week kicked off with an 800-plane RAF raid against Leipzig, which did extensive damage to the town, though 78 bombers failed to return. Subsequent raids by the 8th and later the Italy-based U.S. 15th Air Force struck at fighter manufacturing plants at Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Rostock. In just 6 days, the U.S. Army Air Force managed to put up over 7,400 sorties.
Fortunately, we had the Mustang coming along, and the Mustang had enough range that it could go out and you could use new tactics and lure the Luftwaffe in the air using the bombers for bait. Instead of flying close formation, they'd go out and reach out, get the German fighters as they were assembling, and prevent them from ever attacking the bombers.
What these large raids do is draw the Luftwaffe up into an all-out, full-scale battle over the Reich. And the Luftwaffe loses. The fighter force is decimated. And in the months before D-Day, the great contribution that these raids made was not necessarily destroying German production capacity, but capturing command of the air. Without air superiority, there would have been no D-Day.
At the beginning of March, the 8th Air Force really poured it on as tremendous numbers of heavy bombers were sent against Berlin in broad daylight. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts swarmed to the attack, only to fall like rain before the Mustangs and veteran Thunderbolt pilots.
2 of us attacked 75 109s and shot 3 of them down and damaged about 3 or 4 more. Now, we weren't stupid. We attacked from the rear, attacked onto the back of them and disrupted their formation and broke off their proposed attack on the bombers.
He went into the clouds, so I pulled back up because I knew I'd overrun him. And sure enough, there he come out of the clouds, and I went back down on him again and got on him and hit him right in the right wing, and he started smoking and went on crashed into the trees.
As the Allied bombing effort ramped up over Germany, the troops back in England continued to prepare for D-Day. In the British Army, Montgomery looked over the divisions that had stayed in England throughout the war and was concerned with what he saw.
The troops that Montgomery had to command in England had either seen no action during the war or had seen their last action in the disaster of 1940. They had been well trained, but he had concerns of their lack of experience and insisted that some veterans of the Desert Campaign and Italy be brought in from the Mediterranean and used as assault units in the actual invasion. This was not greeted as really good news by those troops who felt they had done their bit and then some and would once again be thrown into the fire.
For the Americans, inexperience was the order of the day. Though the U.S. Army had been fighting the Germans since Operation Torch, the vast majority of the units earmarked for D-Day had recently been raised and trained in stateside bases. Inexperienced leaders blended with inexperienced men trained to fight in open, mobile warfare where speed and improvisation were the keys to victory. Those assets the Americans possessed in spades, but it would not be the type of warfare they would encounter in Normandy.
The training regimen was so intense that it's hard to say units could ever be more ready. Now, clearly, there's something different about being ready and being experienced in combat.
To give the American First Army a corps of veterans, several units from the Mediterranean were redeployed, including the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions, the 82nd Airborne, and the 2nd Armored. The 1st, known as the Big Red One, had already seen action in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. To lead 1st Army, Ike selected Omar Bradley, a modest, self-effacing infantry officer who had served under Patton in the Mediterranean campaigns. Bradley had 4 corps commanders under him. but only one had ever taken part in an amphibious operation.
This was General Corlett, who had plenty of experience over in the Pacific with the 7th Infantry Division, where he undertook amphibious operations in the Aleutians and then in the Central Pacific campaign at Kwajalein. Well, one of the things that he had learned there in the Central Pacific especially was that they always underestimated the amount of artillery ammunition they would need for supporting the beachhead once the troops were ashore. So that was one of the first things he suggested to the planners at Schaeff. And he also suggested the use of amphibious tractors, which they found to be very useful in the Central Pacific. He was essentially ignored by the American planners because they felt that the Pacific was nothing more than a bush league. He found a more receptive audience in the British, and the British actually did listen to several of his lectures and extract some useful lessons that they then applied to their own beaches in the D-Day operation.
In spite of American perceptions regarding the rigid way in which Britain was approaching Overlord, it was in fact the stood Hitler's Atlantic Wall. After expelling Allied armies from continental Europe in 1940, Hitler set his sights on the invasion and capture of England. The Luftwaffe filled Britain's skies in preparation for the invasion, but despite being outgunned and outnumbered, the Royal Air Force defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Germany's plan, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was put on hold. Almost immediately, the realization that it was only a matter of time before the Allies would try to return to the continent began to gnaw at the German High Command. With nearly 2,000 miles of coastline to defend, the Atlantic coast had to be made invasion-proof. Toward that end, thousands of men had labored to forge the Atlantic Wall, an imposing barricade of concrete obstacles, pillboxes, and heavy guns. The Canadians had been savaged on the beaches of Dieppe in the summer of 1942, and the memory of that experience weighed heavily on the minds of the planners of Overlord. But by early 1944, the Atlantic Wall was built more on reputation than fact. The truth was, defensive emplacements did not exist in the strength and number needed to repel a concerted Allied assault. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel made this abundantly clear after he inspected the Atlantic Wall's defenses in early 1944. His report to Hitler convinced the Fuhrer to give Rommel command of Army Group B, the most important command in France. Rommel took over in March and immediately went to work. Engineering battalions, combat troops, and slave laborers turned beach approaches into a nightmare of concrete dragon's teeth, submerged obstacles, hedgehogs, mines, and spikes. Artillery positions were roofed and walled with concrete and laced together with miles of barbed wire. Thousands of new tank traps, obstacles, and pillboxes were added to the wall, and by the end of May, millions of mines had been buried along the French coast. Elsewhere, poles were planted to guard against glider landings, and fields were flooded to discourage airborne assault. It was a massive effort, but it came at a cost.
Every ton of steel that went into the beach obstacles, that went into the reinforced concrete of the Atlantic Wall, that's a ton of steel that wasn't there to be turned into artillery ammunition.
After Field Marshal Rommel's arrival in Normandy, he put the soldiers of the static divisions to work very quickly to make Normandy a less hospitable landing area. However, his use of his static divisions to do this manual labor had an effect on their readiness, so that by the time that the invasion does come, you find that they operate tactically in the field in a less than optimal way.
As preparations forged ahead on both sides of the Channel, the Germans formed numerous divisions and battalions and sent them to defend portions of the Atlantic Wall. A massive reserve, composed mainly of Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, began to coalesce, and Panzer units were redeployed from the Eastern Front to the West.
In 1943-44, Germans were short on manpower, and much of the manpower from the divisions had to come from the east.
Much of the Atlantic Wall was manned by units that were called static divisions. These were the lowest quality units the German army had. Some of their troops were German, and some of them had been raised in Poland or Czechoslovakia, and there were certain units, the so-called Ost battalions, that were raised primarily from prisoners of war taken from the Soviet army and offered the simple deal. You can stay in a prisoner of war camp and starve to death, or you can join the German army. Many obviously chose to join the German army. These troops were not completely reliable, and in combat, while a few of them would fight hard, most of them would surrender at the first opportunity.
Their equipment was showing that this was really being done on the shoestring compared to the Western forces. Vast amounts of captured equipment, limited ammunition, and they had to adapt the defensive tactics to reflect this.
By the late spring of 1944, the Germans had 4 armies in France. The 7th covered the Normandy region, while the 19th and the 1st were deployed in southern France. The 15th, and by far the strongest, defended the Pas de Calais. Altogether, the 4 armies could depend on a panzer reserve of over 10 divisions. Rommel was convinced that a successful enemy landing meant that the war was lost. Determined to stop the Allies on the beaches, he shunned a defense-in-depth strategy for power at the point of attack. The panzer divisions were the key to Rommel's defense, for they alone had the power to destroy an Allied landing. At the water's edge, resupply efforts hampered by anti-landing boat obstacles, the enemy would be pinned in place until a swift panzer counterattack destroyed their lodgment. To carry out this plan effectively, the panzer divisions in France had to be close to the beaches most likely to be hit. Rommel wanted to redeploy them in this fashion, but his immediate superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, refused to allow it.
Field Marshal von Rundstedt proposes the use of the German armored reserve in a more centralized location farther back so that it can be as easily dispatched to any of the threatened fronts. Field Marshal Rommel, on the other hand, wants to immediately strike the Allies at the water's edge, feels that those reserves need to be farther forward. Ultimately, this conflict will have to be resolved by Adolf Hitler, who, in one of his rare compromises, will kind of try to satisfy both.
Another area of strategic concern for the Germans was precisely where to focus their efforts. Possibilities abounded. Although western France was the most likely site, the Allied blow could conceivably fall in Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, or even the Balkans. Eventually, the German High Command settled on the Pas de Calais and shifted increasing resources to the 15th Army stationed there. Just why the Germans settled on Calais stems from one of the greatest deception operations in military history.
To ensure the success of Overlord, Allied planners realized they needed to do 2 things. They needed to deceive the Germans as to the initial landing point, and they needed to convince the Germans that once the Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, that this was just a secondary operation and the main hammer blow was yet to come. To do this, they established a variety of very tricky deception operations, the most important of which was known as Operation Fortitude South.
Fortitude South sought to convince the Germans that the Allied assault would occur at the Pas de Calais, just 20 miles from England, but 150 miles east of the true invasion site at Normandy. To perpetuate the deception, the Allies went to great pains to feed the Germans bogus information from double agents.
The Germans had a network of spies inside England during the war, all of them sending by radio various messages back to Germany. What the Germans didn't know was that all of them had been caught by British intelligence. They had then been offered a simple deal. Look, you're a spy, okay? And what happens to spies is you get shot. So you can be shot or you can work for us. Would you like to do that? And funny thing, all of them decided, yes, we'd like to do that very much. The British then fed them with intelligence, some of it real, some of it false, which they then broadcast back to Germany by radio. Enough real, solid information was sent to build up the credibility of these agents so the Germans would believe they were the real thing.
Through the double agent network, the Allies fed the Germans a complete order of battle for the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, which included both actual and phantom divisions. While the 4th British, the 1st Canadian, and the 3rd U.S. armies were indeed present in England, the 14th U.S., which included 30 divisions, existed almost entirely on paper. General George Patton, a foe the Germans had come to respect in North Africa, was placed in overall command of FUSAG. Reports of increased troop movements, sightings of new divisional patches, and the construction of new bases near Dover, all bodyguard fabrications, soon flooded German intelligence.
In addition to false radio traffic, an incredible amount of false radio traffic, in fact, there were also inflatable canvas shells that could be blown up that looked like a Sherman medium tank or an inflatable truck. German photo reconnaissance aircraft flew over the area on a regular basis and photographed fields full of dummy tanks so that it looked to the Germans that we had strength where we actually did not.
As all this information reached German intelligence, they overestimated the size of the Allied buildup by about 30 divisions. Part of this was due to the fact that the deception campaign worked very effectively, but also part of it was due to the fact that there was a long-standing policy within German intelligence circles to overestimate the size of the force threatening to invade France so that they could get Hitler to pay more attention to Western Europe and devote more resources over there to prevent an Allied lodgment on the continent.
By spring of 1944, the Germans were not only convinced that the Pas-de-Calais would be the invasion site, but that the Allies had roughly 85 divisions in England, and as many as 20 would be used in the initial assault. In reality, the Allies had less than 50 divisions total in the theater, and only 8 were slated for D-Day. It was a masterful execution of wartime deception, one that involved hundreds of agents, thousands of specialists, and even the Allied air forces. Day after day, Allied bombers pounded the French coast, and since such massive air attacks could obviously not be concealed from the German high command, the Allies used the attacks to perpetuate Fortitude South's deception plan. For every ton of bombs that landed in Normandy, 2 more tons of bombs hit the Pas-de-Calais area. A sustained pattern appeared to the Germans. The Allies were clearly softening up the Calais area, and the attacks in Normandy were simply a diversion.
The transportation plan was devised by Professor Zali Zuckerman, and he was a bright guy that had observed how the bombing campaigns worked in Sicily and in Italy. And he'd come back with the idea that there should be a transportation plan in which there would be a carefully focused bombing campaign that would concentrate on the coastal defenses, on the airfields, and on the lines of communications. And he'd start bombing the lines of communication some 90 days before the invasion, start bombing the airfields 24 days before, and start bombing the invasion defenses the day before the invasion.
The underlying goal of the transportation plan was to isolate the coming battlefield, and in early May, the full weight of Allied air power was unleashed. Every squadron in Europe got into the act. In the 9th Air Force, P-47 squadrons discovered they could drop a bridge with 2 or 3 well-placed bombs. Marauder outfits also hammered at vital bridges.
Well, being a tactical aircraft, our targets were essentially anything that would hold up the Nazi capacity to move divisions, to move artillery, to move anything. And toward the end of the war, where the Germans had been able to move a division in a matter of a day or so, they couldn't move that division in 2 weeks.
The RAF's Typhoon squadrons destroyed truck convoys, sniped at hidden tanks with rockets, and generally shot up any traffic they could find behind the beaches. 8th and 9th Air Force fighter pilots scoured the French countryside in their P-38s, P-51s, and P-47s, relentlessly attacking trains and their locomotives.
We were sent out for a specific train that they knew was carrying important ammunition and so on to the front, and I was the only flight left with bombs by the time we spotted the train. But we managed to cut it in 2 and stop the train.
The 8th Air Force pounded rail yards during the day, while Bomber Command attacked them at night.
I was lucky enough to
make the first mission over Germany on which correspondents were permitted. They sort of trained 5 of us from the various organizations to fly with them, and we flew with different units. On that very first raid, the New York Times fellow was killed, shot down in a Liberator. But we had the Luftwaffe with it for 2.5 hours. It was a long air battle. We lost 12 planes out of 57. Pretty heavy loss, and we had a lot of anti-aircraft. It was a very exciting day. By June 5th, fully half of all the rolling stock and locomotives in France had been destroyed. The Germans could move only 8 to 10 trains at a time on the shattered French rail network, and since a typical division needed about 3 or 4 trainloads of supplies a day in combat, the Allies had, for all intents and purposes, isolated the Normandy battlefield. Though German industry still produced vast quantities of war material despite the Allied strategic bombing campaign, the fact was the transportation plan destroyed Germany's ability to get that material to the Western Front. In Normandy, gasoline grew scarce, ammunition was in short supply, and just getting basic supplies to the troops became a serious problem. The transportation plan served a vital function, but the price was high. Over 12,000 Allied airmen died or went missing in the 9 weeks leading up to the invasion. In fact, more men died in the air in preparation for the landing than died on the beaches on June 6th. It was one of the great ironies of air power. Though it saved lives of countless infantrymen, it came at a high cost. As the campaign to isolate the Normandy area continued, aerial reconnaissance and reports from the French resistance indicated a redeployment of German troops from the Calais area to Normandy. These movements stemmed from Hitler's suspicions following an incident that had occurred in late April. On the night of April 28th, the 4th Infantry Division, slated to land at Utah on D-Day, was engaged in Operation Tiger, a practice assault at Slapton Sands.
The 1st Engineer Special Brigade, which had the same job on Utah Beach that the 5th and 6th had on Omaha Beach, they were involved in the exercises, and some German E-boats got into some of the LSTs that were involved in that exercise.
The torpedo boats were successful, and my brigade that night lost 653 men.
There were some people there who were bigoted, and that they may have, drowned, and they wanted to be sure that they were drowned and they hadn't been captured by the E-boats.
Everybody was forbidden to say anything about that. They didn't want to know how much damage they had caused.
They brought in wounded that were just, bodies were stacked on an LCT and kind of like cordwood.
When briefed about Slapton Sands, Hitler immediately noticed the similarity between that stretch of English coastline and the Normandy beaches. Could the Allies really be planning to hit Normandy? Despite all the evidence they had that Calais was the target, Hitler ordered some of the divisions around Calais to be redeployed to Normandy.
The reports of that new division and its arrival in Normandy quickly made their way up through the ranks of Allied intelligence, so that later in the month of May, an intelligence report included the following words: "The recent trend of movement of German land forces toward the Cherbourg area tends to support the view that the Le Havre-Cherbourg area is regarded as the likely and perhaps even the main point of assault." So the Germans, after Slapton Sands, had every reason to suspect that a landing could take place at the beach we would ultimately call Utah.
From Intel's perspective, the Allies were about to hit the beach against a prepared and waiting foe, and it was too late to change the plan. Montgomery had been refining Cossack's original overlord plan since January. On May 15th, he took the Allied High Command through every aspect of the campaign to come. The British and Canadians would land on 3 beaches, codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Americans were slated for Utah Beach on the far right flank and Omaha to the left of Utah. In between, a Ranger battalion would scale the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, where they would knock out a massive coastal gun emplacement at the top of the bluffs. To support the amphibious landings, 3 parachute divisions would be dropped behind the beaches to disrupt or block any German counterattacks. Monty's plan envisioned a swift capture of Caen on D-Day itself, followed by a sweeping armored breakout on the open ground of the Falaise Plain. The Americans were to push off the beaches and secure the Cotentin Peninsula before driving on Cherbourg, the biggest and closest port to the invasion beaches. The amphibious landing would be preceded by a massive combined air and naval bombardment directed at the beach defenses. Thousands of aircraft would sortie, and everything from battleships to rocket-firing assault boats would be employed.
In order to give the initial assault waves of Operation Overlord armor support, the Allies developed Sherman DD tanks, or duplex drive tanks. These tanks had, in effect, a canvas barrier, a hull that could be raised up above the level the water would come. The DD, or duplex drive, meant that they actually had propellers on the back of the tank that had a takeoff gear on the engine, and so when you switched over, the propeller was getting the engine power as opposed to the tracks. The idea was to motor into the beach until the tracks hit bottom, switch over to the tracks, drive up out of the water, drop the canvas, instant tank support to the assault waves.
The Overlord plan represented the culmination of 4 years of lessons at the hands of the German army. It was bold, relied heavily on combined arms operations, and depended on the ability of the initial waves of infantry to get ashore and push inland to link up with the airborne troops as quickly as possible. That would set the stage for the armored breakout into the rolling plains beyond the Normandy hedgerows. If all went well, the Allies could be in Germany by the end of 1944. The war might even end by Christmas. As the time for the invasion neared, all southern England was suddenly sealed off from the rest of the world.
Security was really tight. We were put in a gated, fenced compound that wasn't too far from the base we were at, and you couldn't get out of there.
I thought I was being put in a stockade, but I'd never been court-martialed or anything, so that's what it looked like, a barbed wire fence around them.
About every 100 yards was a machine gun, and we knew anybody tried to climb that fence was going to get it.
Everybody was going through those staging areas that we had built, and they were being put in there and then to be taken out. They'd put them in, take them out. They'd be loading them on the ship. They'd take them out and they'd bring them back. Nobody knew what was going on.
When we got into the staging camps down near the ports where we were to disembark from, at that point we would have daily meetings with all of the infantry and the artillery and the signal people and engineers and all. And of course, then the information that was of a bigoted nature got wider spread. But we were closeted in these camps. We couldn't go in and out of them once we went in.
A week or two before D-Day, they come and told us that y'all guys are lucky. Prior to anybody went in, we were going to go into the beaches and fire on selected targets, and you was going to be in the first wave. So we all thanked them, for the compliments.
I came back to company, and I had the job of teaching the officers what I had learned. So the only thing we didn't know was when.
SHAEF planners had predicted that in early June, tide and moon conditions came together to give the Allies just what they were after: a full moon for the airborne drop and a low tide at dawn on the beaches. On May 30th, Eisenhower issued the code phrase Exercise +6, indicating the invasion would be 6 days hence. Monday, June 5th, would be D-Day.
About the 1st of June, I guess it was,
We were moved into a camp just outside Plymouth. And there was a lot of materiel, tanks, trucks, all kinds of boxes, ammunition and so on the roads, ready to be loaded onto the various ships that were going to take part in the invasion.
We all went down to camps, tent camps that had been set up near the ports of embarkation, primarily in southeastern England, Portsmouth and Falmouth and Plymouth and so on. At that point, the roads were all clogged with military vehicles, primarily with these big tank transporters. If you can imagine what meeting one of those big tank transporters is in a small English village. Of course, it's taking up practically all of the road and buildings on each side, and you come head to head with one of those things with no notice.
A week before the invasion, we left the camp and they put us on an airfield in the vicinity, and we stayed on that airfield for approximately 7 days. We didn't know where we were going at the time. Then they showed us maps of where we were going without the names. It was only 3 days actually before the invasion that we knew exactly where we were going, that it was going to be France and Normandy.
We got word that a German unit had moved into the exact area where we were going to jump in Normandy. So the mission was changed, and we were moved to the area around St. Mare-ad-Lys.
And they had these tables that were mock-up things of Normandy that described these various areas that we were to attack.
They neglected to tell us about the hedgerows. They neglected to tell us that we might be scattered.
You know the general area for about 30 miles around. You know the nearest little towns or burgs. If you can remember everything, you're lucky.
Embarkation of men and equipment took place simultaneously at 9 seaports along the southern and southwestern coasts of England.
Our assignment was to load motor transports. They were the Liberty ships, but they had the British stevedores, and they were too slow because at 10 o'clock in the morning they'd yell "tee up," and they'd pull the lever bank, and a big tank might be hanging over the hole ready to be lowered into the hull of the ship, but they'd scramble down and have to have their tea.
As vehicles of all descriptions crept into the holds of LSTs and LCMs, assault boats ran a continuous shuttle service from the docks to the transports lying at anchor in the harbor.
So much material was moving through the port that they had to get ships out of the port so that more ships could come in and load up this stuff, and along with other troops and so on. And we moved out into the channel, and we just stayed there for, I've forgotten now, probably 2, 3, 4 days.
The port river was just crowded with like parked cars in a big car park, only it was just one landing craft after another all the way up the river.
While Navy and Coast Guard crews made final preparations, the last of the ships were loaded to capacity. The time for departure from the English coast was finally at hand.
We started off about 1 o'clock, 2:30, something at range. And when we got out in the water, it looked like you could walk from one boat to the other.
As far as your eyes could see in any direction were landing crafts, transports, Navy ships, and it was the most awesome sight in the world.
Even as the first ships of the invasion force put to sea, a storm front swept over the English Channel. Weather, the one element beyond the control of the Allied High Command, threatened the success of the invasion. Ike refused to risk disaster and postponed D-Day for at least 24 hours. The advance convoys of the fleet, already en route to Normandy, were ordered back.
That was a rather harrowing 24 hours because it was really rough weather. Everyone was seasick before we even got to anywhere near the beaches.
The weather was poor. A lot of people got sick, even on our ship. It was sitting not far from the harbor.
But when we loaded the planes that first morning and then had to sit there for an hour, then pull out again, then we got deflated, and there was a lot of hard feelings over it.
That was the sickest bunch of guys you ever saw. because everybody wanted to go.
Lulled into a sense of security by the bad weather, German naval patrols on the English Channel were canceled. Rommel, convinced that the Allies would come on a high tide in good weather, decided to go home to Germany for a visit. Tuesday, June 6th, would be his wife's birthday. Early on the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower and his officers gathered for the morning weather conference. The situation looked hopeless, but Ike's senior weather officer predicted a small break in the storm for June 6th.
Eisenhower knew that the next time the tidal conditions were going to be right would be in 2 weeks in the middle of June. And there was no guarantee that the weather was going to be good then. So he could either wait 2 weeks or roll the dice and go on June 6th. The first thing he did before he made the decision was he pulled his senior officers. And they split right down the middle. 3 wanted to go, 3 wanted to wait.
The final decision was left to Ike. Quietly, he gave the order, "Okay, let's go." Those 3 words unleashed the greatest military operation in history as almost 6,000 vessels streamed out of English ports destined for the Normandy coast.
Southampton Harbor is about 20 miles inland from the Island of Wight. And the night before the invasion took place, you could walk on ships clear out to the Island of Wight, like jumping from one ship to the other.
You know, it's hard to explain what you feel because you're looking around, you see other ships with you, so you feel kind of fairly safe.
The group I was with said we were going out to come back and attack England again. They had been doing that quite a bit. We stayed out overnight. The next morning, they began to get worried a little bit that we weren't attacking England.
Back in England, paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Division were making their final preparations. Some 20,000 men would embark from 22 airfields on over 1,200 transport aircraft and gliders. Late in the afternoon, Eisenhower drove over to see the 101st off.
But Eisenhower stopped, talked to me, and I don't know whether that was clicking my boots together sharply or what that alerted him, but for being the Supreme Commander, very gracious to me, and I'm very happy that the incident happened.
It was nice to have him come there and say bon voyage, you know, and I certainly respected him for it.
The night before we jumped, right before we got on the plane, the one they call Axis Sally, we used to call it a bitch of Berlin. She says, "Well, all you 82nd Airborne boys are going to miss your warm blankets tonight, but we'll have a hot reception at 88's for you."
When we go in to make a jump, we try to carry enough stuff to supply us for at least 3 days till they figure they can resupply us.
We were really loaded down. We were packed down with everything you could carry. I had a landmine strapped to my left leg, trench knife to my right. Yeah, 3 days rations. I don't know what all we had.
You know, a rifle, 168 rounds ammo. You had to be carrying about 100 pounds of dead weight.
And you couldn't walk, you had to shuffle. You were strapped so heavy. We got in our equipment and loaded up, and there was no problems, there was no kidding around. Everybody was in their serious state of mind.
When we took off, why, it was still twilight in England, under double daylight saving time, probably around 10 o'clock or something. And the planes formed up, flying around the field, and formed up, and then we headed out of there, but we headed west.
It took at least 2 hours to get them all flying around till they get in the right formation. By the time we got on our way, I went to sleep.
It was rather a somber affair. Everybody had in the back of his mind a secret fear. You didn't know what you were going to get into. Nobody could tell that. But most of the guys were pretty quiet when it came to flying to the jump, even the loud-mouthed ones.
The pilot got on the intercom and said, "Okay, guys, look down." And we looked down, and you never saw so many boats in your life. We were passing over the Armada, and it was a chilling experience. How can we lose with all of that?
I was there on